Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In our last session about Scope 3 emissions, I mentioned that for many organizations, Scope 3 makes up about 70% of their total emissions. I got an insightful comment of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, which I'd like to discuss today, as it highlights some misconceptions about Scope 3 emissions reporting. Let's dive in. Hi Norbert here, I'm energy engineer and GHG accountant. In this video number 6, supplement on the lesson, you will see that this course is not just a mechanical rattling of facts, but rather a live discussion that is more constructive for your knowledge, like an agora of the ancient Greece. In the same way, I'd like to expose you to a constructive, critical note that came from the same GHG Management Institute in Washington, where I followed my course and obtained the certification. A teacher at the institute pointed out something very important. On last lesson's object, Scope 3 emissions appear much larger than Scope 1 or 2 emissions, but comparing them directly isn't always appropriate. Why? Because Scope 3 covers a much wider boundary, also in the dimension of time. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions from sources owned or controlled by the company within the reporting year. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from purchased electricity or steam or heat, but also in 1 year. But Scope 3 emissions, these include emissions from the supply chain, business travel, product use, and even future and past emissions that are estimated. For example, product that is decaying and which is emitting gases during its decomposition on the landfill, for example. This means that Scope 3 emissions are inherently larger because it encompasses emissions beyond the company's direct operations across multiple years and companies. Another point the Institute raised is the issue of double counting. I mentioned at the end of the lesson that double counting may be an issue, but as they correctly pointed out, double counting is actually built into the design of GHG accounting frameworks. Why? Because every company's Scope 3 is another company's Scope 1 or 2. And that's okay. The goal of GHG reporting isn't to avoid double counting, but to improve transparency and accountability across the entire value chain. Now let's expand the discussion. An expert from the GHG Management Institute wrote in an article, the current GHG accounting system, largely based on the GHG protocol, was designed in the early 2000s, when corporate emissions reporting was voluntary. Back then, the focus was simply on making companies aware of their emissions, not necessarily on precise, standardized accounting. Fast forward 20 years, and things have changed. Governments, investors, and regulators now want to use this GHG data for decision making. But the GHG protocol still allows companies enormous flexibility in setting their reporting boundaries, leading to inconsistencies in data and making it difficult to compare one company's emissions with another's. So, where does this leave us? Will opponents now say that GHG accounting is bugged? No, this practice still makes sense, despite double counting, because the primary goal is transparency and accountability, not avoiding overlaps in emissions reporting. Here's why. Double counting is expected, not a flaw. Every company's Scope 3 emissions are another company's 1 or 2 emissions. The difference is that Scope 1 and 2 can be influenced much more on a one-to-one basis than Scope 3. So we are in some measure responsible for Scope 3, but share that with others. This redundancy ensures that emissions are pictured across the whole value chain, so no major sources are ignored. Why double counting is not a problem? Different reporting boundaries. A single ton of CO₂ may appear in multiple reports, but the companies focus on their own contribution and reduction strategies, so they need a complete picture. It prevents blind spots. If emissions were reported only once per supply chain, many indirect emissions would be hidden, making it harder for emitters to see their own picture and where they have to work on. The purpose of GHG accounting. Corporate responsibility. It helps companies identify where they can cut within their operations and supply chain. The influence of a business on a supply chain and from the tail side on the customers is limited and shared with others. Regulatory compliance. Governments and investors need companies to report emissions for policymaking and risk assessments. Avoid greenwashing. Without Scope 3 reporting, companies could simply outsource emission-intensive activities to suppliers and claim they are carbon neutral. The system is evolving to improve accuracy, comparability and usability. Regulators may refine Scope 3 methodologies to reduce uncertainty, but transparency will remain the main objective. So the bottom line is, double counting in GHG account is not a bug. It's a feature that ensures that no emissions are overlooked. It allows every company to take responsibility for its own impact, leading to real action, rather than emissions being ignored or passed around. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. I expect next week will be a lesson again in the course of 12.